I will hand you over to Dr. Ian Lowe.
Thank you very much. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and get ear-bashed about biospheres. I want to begin by acknowledging the Jinibara people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I've said to a few of you before that paying respect to elders isn't an integral part of the whitefellow tradition, but the idea appeals to me more as I totter unsteadily into that category myself, the idea of respecting elders. Acknowledging the traditional owners has become a bit of a ritual, and even those politicians who dishonestly campaigned against the modest proposal of a voice to Parliament usually remember to acknowledge the traditional owners. But it should be more than a ritual, because the first Australians worked out over tens of thousands of years how to live within the limits of the natural systems of this harsh and unforgiving continent. And they embodied those knowings not just in custom and practice, not just in song and dance and ceremony, but in their system of laws. They had a system of laws that forced people to live within the limits of natural systems. And I'd suggest to you that if we aim to survive as a civilization, we really need to reach that level of organisation, of having a system of laws that allows us to live within the limits of natural systems. And that's why I think biospheres are important. I gave the topic, "Are biospheres grounds for cautious optimism?" And I thought I could say, yes, are there any questions? But I thought that might seem a bit glib, so I'll expand on why I think they are grounds for cautious optimism. But as you were reminded in the introduction, I'm not an objective observer. I'm about as impartial as a Donald Trump appointee, because I'm actually on the board of the Noosa Biosphere Reserve Foundation. And I'm not here telling you they're good because I'm on their board. I'm on their board because I go around telling people that they're good. I think they're a great idea. Let me start the story 30 years ago, when I had been appointed by Rosalind Joan Kelly, who was Minister for the Environment in the Keating government before she fell on her whiteboard marker. She appointed me to chair the advisory group that produced the first independent national report on the state of the environment. And after she was replaced by John Faulkner, he told us that he wanted an honest report, the good, the bad and the ugly, that nobody can run away from. And that was a very important commission, because a few of the state governments had produced state of the environment reports, which had really been sanitised within an inch of their lives, and which told people what a great job the government was doing as the environment disintegrated around them. So we were told to produce an honest report. And it was rushed to the printers shortly before the 1996 election, because I'd read the tea leaves and I thought that the Howard regime was probably going to be elected, and I thought we might not have been given the same freedom to produce an honest report. So I was literally at CSIRO Publishing on the Friday, when the election was held on the Saturday, signing off on the page proofs, so that if there were to be a change of government, I could assure the new government that the report was at the printers and could not be edited. Because I'm sure they would have been very unhappy with the last chapter, which I'll come to in a minute. Our report said probably nothing that would have been news to anyone with an IQ above their shoe size, although that rules out some elected politicians. We said that we have a beautiful and unique environment, and a lot of it is in good shape by international standards, but we had some serious problems that needed to be addressed. And we identified 5 serious problems: the loss of our unique biodiversity, the state of our inland rivers, especially the Murray-Darling system, loss or degradation of productive rural land, pressures on the coastal zone from increasing population and lifestyle choices, and rapidly increasing greenhouse gas emissions. There have been 5 subsequent reports at 5-year intervals. The second one said we had a beautiful and unique environment, and much of it was in good condition by international standards, but we had some serious problems that needed to be addressed. Loss of our unique biodiversity, the state of our inland rivers, stop me if you've heard this one. Basically, all 5 reports have identified the same serious problems with an increasing sense of urgency. The final chapter of that first report spoke to the underlying causes. It said, no industry or sector or community is to blame for the environmental problems. They are actually the direct outcome of the growth and distribution of our population, our lifestyle choices and the technologies we use. And that was a very direct challenge to the general model of governance, which basically seems to assume that as long as the economy is going gangbusters, we can always solve any environmental problems. We said in summary in that first report that those challenges needed to be addressed if we were to achieve our stated goal of sustainable development. Hands up if you know that we have a stated goal of sustainable development. It's definitely a minority perversion. In case there's anyone here who's come onto this planet since this happened, in 1992, at the culmination of a process started by the Hawke government called the ESD process, Ecologically Sustainable Development, which appointed 9 different sector working groups with a diversity of representation on each. I was on the Energy Supply and Use group, and it included scientists, it included industrialists, a trade unionist, a member of the Indigenous community, a representative of the Consumers Association, representatives of the health system and so on. We were nearly unanimous apart from the public servant who'd swallowed the snake oil of the School of Economics at the Australian National University. And I had the surreal experience of hearing this learned gentleman explaining to the manager of Caltex how the oil market worked, based on his profound understanding from an undergraduate degree in economics. But the conclusions of those groups fed together into a national statement, and in December 1992, COAG, the Council of Australian Governments, meeting in simulated majesty in Canberra, adopted the National Strategy for Ecologically Sustainable Development. So in principle, the Commonwealth and all state and territory governments, Labor or coalition, are committed to the principle of development which is ecologically sustainable. And if you look at the fine print of that statement, it says we're committed to a pattern of economic development that will not reduce opportunities for future generations, that will strive for equity within and between generations, that recognises the global implications of our choices and our policies, that strives to maintain the integrity of our natural ecological systems and protects our unique biodiversity. Now, I've said it would take a very generous assessor to detect any sign that any recent government, state or territory, Labor or coalition, even knows that there is a national strategy for ecologically sustainable development, let alone seeing that as the framework within which we should be making our choices. I promised I wouldn't say anything about the election because I'm sure you've all voted early and voted often in the hope of having a government that will focus on some real-world issues rather than economic trivia, but there has basically been a deafening silence at this election about the really important issues of whether we are living sustainably or whether we are steering for the ecological iceberg on our good ship Titanic and simply arguing not even about rearranging the deck chairs, but just about how many deck chairs there are and which side of the boat they should be on. There's been hardly any talk about climate, apart from the crack-brained idea that building 7 nuclear power stations might accelerate climate change irresponsibly. And we've not done anything about the increasing urgency of the impacts of climate change on Australia. In the 1980s, when I first wrote a paperback book about climate change, because I thought then it was a serious problem that we might need to address, the science was saying that we would see increasing extreme events, and extreme events of increasing severity. And I remember at the Kyoto conference in 1997, when most of world business was saying, nothing to see here, what are you worried about? The one economic sector that was at the Kyoto conference saying this was a serious issue was the insurance industry. because they were saying in 1997 that they could read the red ink on their balance sheet. And they said that it was getting harder to increase premiums at a rate which is actuarially sound, because they are not philanthropies. They set premiums that reflect the cost of likely payouts. And they said in 1997 that discounting for inflation, the payouts for property damage in the 1980s were more than for the 1960s and the 1970s put together. And the payouts for the first 5 years of the 1990s were more than for all of the 1980s. So they said we are now discounting for inflation, paying out for property damage at 5 times the rate as we were 20 years ago. And they said, and were dismissed as hysterical nonsense for saying so in 1997, by 2020, if we ask people to pay the premiums, which our actuaries tell us are financially sound, large numbers of people will be unable to afford to insure their properties. And hundreds of thousands of people, they said, by 2020, will be losing properties uninsured, and governments will be forced to bail them out. Wasn't that a hysterical overreaction? Isn't it a good job we didn't listen to them and take action? We aren't just seeing increasing severe impacts on human civilisation, although they are really significant. The 2019-20 bushfires, the 2021 floods. Lismore in 2021 had 3 floods which historically would all have been 1 in 100-year events. The idea of a 1 in 100-year flood doesn't make any sense in the new world. In 1987, at the first National Conference on Climate Change, the late Professor Stark of James Cook University pointed out that the intensity of tropical cyclones is a function of sea surface temperature. And he said if the science of climate that we're being told about is correct, by the 2020s, we might see Category 4 or even Category 5 cyclones hitting the northern Queensland coast. And who knows, there might even be lower strength cyclones crossing the coast as far south as Brisbane. And he was attacked by the tourist industry for this hysterical overreaction, saying things that the science didn't justify. And of course, we now see Category 4 or 5 cyclones crossing the North Queensland coast almost every year. And we saw recently the waters off Brisbane being warm enough for a tropical depression to reform as a Category 2 cyclone and cross the coast. So it really is a serious issue, but it's only one of a whole heap of serious issues that science has been warning governments about literally for decades. In 1992, William Ripple got together a group of scientists and published the World Scientists' Warning to Humanity, pointing out that climate change was only one of a series of serious environmental problems that were a risk to civilisation. In 2017, he got together a larger group and published the World Scientists' Second Warning. And I'm one of the 15,000 scientists who endorsed that second warning. And it pointed out that there has been one success story in the last 25 years. The Montreal Protocol to slow down the release of the substances depleting the ozone layer was then toughened up at Stockholm and at London, and we've reduced to about 20% of the peak level the volume of release of ozone-depleting substances, so the hole in the ozone layer is not getting any worse, and on current trends will probably repair over the next 50 years. That, they said, is the one positive large-scale environmental indicator in the last 25 years. Every other indicator is going south. Freshwater per capita down 25%. World fish catch down 20%. Forest area less by 100 million hectares. Numbers of ocean dead zones more or less doubled. Rate of release of greenhouse gases still accelerating. Rate of climate change still accelerating. Perhaps the most worrying indicator was the loss of biodiversity. They pointed out in 1992 that the average species abundance then was 60% of the 1970 level. By 2017, it was 40% of the 1970 level. And on current trends, we could lose somewhere between a sixth and a third of all species this century. we are losing species at a rate comparable with the great extinction episodes, like the famous one when the meteorite polluted the atmosphere and wiped out the dinosaurs. And in a sense, that is a more serious problem than climate change. Climate change is an urgent problem, but the loss of biodiversity is irreversible. In principle, with concerted action, we could restore a pre-industrial climate in a couple of hundred years. But there is no way of restoring an extinct species, and no way of repairing degraded ecosystems that are causing the loss of biodiversity on any realistic sort of human scale. So it would be very easy to get depressed. In fact, as one of my friends said, there's a fine line between pessimism and despair, and anyone who looks at the global trends is inevitably pessimistic. But despair is contagious, and despair is self-fulfilling. If you think you can't solve a problem, it won't be solved. I was reminded that in Candide, Voltaire said, faced with dreadful problems in Europe, that he urged people to cultiver son jardin, look after your garden. And the one thing we can do is start where we are and start doing small positive things to look after our part of the world and to be, as Gandhi said, the change you want to see in the world. And that's why I'm positive about the idea of biospheres. So what is a biosphere reserve? Well, the Biosphere program was started by UNESCO in 1971, and they argued that we need to supplement, augment, reinforce the system of protected areas, national parks and other areas that are off limits to human activity, by encouraging the people around those protected areas to behave in a way that maintains their integrity, to manage their social and economic needs in ways that don't undermine the integrity of those precious protected areas, which are havens of refugia for our biodiversity. So UNESCO set up this system of biosphere reserves, and I'll read you what it says in their document, if I can see it in this light. Biosphere reserves are areas of terrestrial, marine and coastal ecosystems managed with the aim of balancing biodiversity conservation and the sustainable use of natural resources. The planning and management of biosphere reserves relies on the participation of the local community and interesting stakeholders. And there are now about 700 of these biosphere reserves around the world. There are 5 in Australia, and 3 of them are the contiguous areas of the Great Sandy region, Noosa and the Sunshine Coast. Noosa was the first of those 20 years ago, and the other 2 which have supplemented it has provided a large contiguous area that is a biosphere. So what's the principle of a biosphere? The underlying principle is that the social and economic needs of the community are met in ways which do not damage the underlying values of the natural systems. And it started with enlightened self-interest, I'd suggest to you, in Noosa, where they recognised that their only economic activity is tourism. Tourists come because of the natural values. It's enlightened self-interest to try and protect those natural values so the tourists keep coming and spending their money. And Noosa Council and Douglas Shire were the 2 councils, I think the only 2 in Australia, which recognised the damage that growth was doing and decided to limit both resident population and tourist populations to maintain the integrity of natural areas. Now, I don't think it was any coincidence when Queensland reorganised local government that they amalgamated Douglas Shire with Cairns, and they amalgamated Noosa with Maroochydore and Caloundra to knock this anti-growth nonsense on the head. But if that was the aim, it backfired catastrophically. Douglas Shire amalgamated with Cairns elected a Green mayor, and when Noosa was rolled in with Maroochydore and Caloundra, the Maroochydore mayor and the Noosa mayor stood for mayor of the new authority. So it was really a referendum on whether the people of the Sunshine Coast wanted to extend the Noosa approach to Maroochydore and Caloundra or the Maroochydore approach to Noosa and Caloundra. Bob Abbott, the Noosa mayor, had a majority in every polling booth. every one of the 37 polling booths. I mean, only the Soviet Union under Putin has that one-sided an election that one candidate has a majority in every polling booth. The people of the Sunshine Coast said that they wanted to extend the Noosa approach to the rest of the coast rather than risk the Sunshine Coast finishing up like the Gold Coast. So how does a biosphere operate? Here's a list of the things that are meant to happen. Firstly, there's a focus on ecologically sustainable development. Those words actually appear, ecologically sustainable. Sustainable development is often used to mean something slightly less worse than the other lot we're doing. It's often used to refer to things which clearly are not sustainable on any long-term approach. But the adjective ecologically is the critical one because it says development that sustains the integrity of the ecological systems on which we depend. The second point is that within a biosphere there are reserves which are designated protected areas, but around them the rest of the community is committed to the idea that their social and economic needs are met in ways which do not undermine the integrity of the natural systems. And that means that they are effectively, the term that's been used by UNESCO is living laboratories. It's a reflection, I think, of a more sophisticated view of science. I grew up with the image of science as, the white-coated expert peering at a test tube or at some physical property. And the argument was that science is objective, that any responsible scientist will always come to the same conclusion. And that, of course, is true if you ask a scientist to measure the rate of reaction between two chemicals or the tensile strength of an aluminium alloy. But it's not true if you ask a scientist to look at Lake Gulya and tell you whether it's safe to have 500 people swimming there or the limit is only 50. There is no sense in which you can be, it's not a controlled experiment in which everything is held constant except two variables, one of which you change and the other of which you measure. And it's also impossible for us as humans to be objective observers of natural systems. I sometimes say that if you talk to people who are followers of the two different teams after a football match, it's difficult to believe they watched the same match. They'll disagree about matters of fact, like whether the ball was out of play, about matters of opinion, such as whether a free kick should have been awarded, and often about the visual acuity of the official in charge or the official's integrity or even the marital status of their parents. But they each, to some extent, see what they want to see. And in the same sense, we can't be objective observers of the natural world because if you think of the analogy of the football match, we're not in the stands watching. We're out there on the field. We're face down in the mud. We can't see what's happening behind us. And of course, we have a vested interest in the outcome. So there's been the development in the last 20 years of an approach that's been called sustainability science, of recognising the inherent complexity of natural systems and recognising that we can't be objective observers, but we can realise that we're in a living laboratory in which we do things and then observe the consequences. And if you're smart, if the consequences are bad, you don't do it again. If the consequences are good, you do it again. I mean, I think it was Einstein said one definition of insanity is to do the same thing and expect a different result. But I think politicians, by that definition, are often mentally challenged because they often keep doing what they did and expect a different result. The whole point of it being a living laboratory is that every time we change something, provide a free bus service or provide for cycleways or put a limit on the number of craft that can use the river, we are changing one thing in a complex system, and the rational approach is to observe the changes, see whether we can keep doing that or whether we need to change. And it's an axiomatic part of the biospheres that they are living laboratories, that we are engaged in a constant practice of making policy initiatives, observing the effect, and then changing our approach in the light of it. The fourth point is that they represent a global network, and there's an international conference in China later this year, the first one in 10 years, which means I need to speak more loudly into the microphone to cope with the natural forces. The idea of there being a global network is that we don't have to pioneer everything. We can learn from the other biospheres. And since there are over 700 of them, some of them with similar climatic regimes, some of them with similar populations. Is this futile, or can you still hear me? Okay. The fifth point is that there has to be local involvement. In the Noosa area, because there was such a fuss made about applying to be a biosphere, the community understands it's a biosphere, the businesses understand it's a biosphere. Tourism Noosa is having a working breakfast later this month to talk about how they're meeting their responsibilities within the concept of the biosphere, because they recognise that as a tourist industry, they have to maintain the integrity of the natural systems for people to keep coming to Noosa. We have to think about sustainable solutions, about meeting our short-term needs in ways that we can, in principle, keep doing for the foreseeable future. It seems to me that, in principle, sustainable development is a pattern of development that can continue forever. But I don't think we have the capacity to know what's sustainable forever, but we should at least be able to work out if something's sustainable for the foreseeable future. And it's a real problem, I think, in dealing with the political system. I remember when he was Science Minister, Barry Jones said, in Canberra, a long-term thinker is somebody who looks beyond this year's budget, and a very long-term thinker is somebody who looks beyond this term of office. But that's a really tragically short-sighted approach, because our decision makers are making choices which literally set in concrete what our options will be for 50 years, or in some cases longer. If we were silly enough to build nuclear reactors, we would be committed to generating radioactive waste that has to be managed for geological time, hundreds of thousands of years. So we urgently need to have our decision makers taking a much longer term approach, thinking about where we want to be not just next year, not just in 2030, but in 2070 or 2100, where we want to be at the end of the century, and what decisions now make it easier to get to those desired futures. Final point of the biosphere reserves is that there has to be a periodic review. Noosa Council is just now starting to prepare the 10-year review, because it will soon be 20 years since they became a biosphere. Every 10 years they have to report to UNESCO and see whether they get a koala stamp, or, as has happened to some biospheres, have had their that capacity revoked because they haven't been meeting their social and economic needs within the limits of the natural systems. There are a whole set of projects going on in the Noosa biosphere to try and ensure that there is good science backing up what is being done, tracking the habitat range of glossy black cockatoos, tracking the movements of injured koalas, looking at the behaviour of bull sharks, trying to improve practice in the hinterland around Kin to ensure that the runoff from farms does not destroy the integrity of the ecological system, and so on. But the important point is that it is and always will be a work in progress. We can't put our hand on our heart and say, we are confident now that what we are doing is sustainable forever. What we can do is put our hand on our heart and say, we have made some changes which we think are positive, we are monitoring them, and we will test the long-term impact. And if it turns out that they're working, we'll keep doing that. If it turns out that there's a problem, we'll do something different. The fundamental point is that the whole idea of biospheres is to recognise that it's our it's our duty to manage our social and economic needs in ways that do not undermine the integrity of the natural systems. Because if you think about it, we depend on natural systems for the absolute essentials: breathable air, drinkable water, the capacity to produce our food. And we also depend on them for things that are quite important, like the sense of place we get from our natural surroundings, the spiritual refreshment we get from being in natural Australia rather than in a concrete jungle. So in that sense, I've argued that the biosphere approach is a model for how we should be living quite generally. It shouldn't just be Noosa and the Great Sandy region and the Sunshine Coast that feels committed to making social and economic decisions that do not undermine the integrity of natural systems. In a mature world, in a world reflecting the values of the first Australians, we would, wherever we live in Australia, be making decisions that meet our economic needs, meet our social desires within the limits of the natural systems, that preserves their integrity. And fundamentally that means recognising that there are limits to growth and that we hold this land temporarily in trust for future generations, indeed for all future generations, and we share it with countless millions of other species. And saying we can leave these sort of choices to the market is basically saying we don't give a bugger for future generations because they can't express their wishes in the market. We don't give a bugger for the other species because they can't express their wishes in the market. If we leave it to the market, we're saying that the short-term needs or the short-term wishes of this generation predominate over all future generations and all other species. And that, I believe, is morally indefensible. Now, before I take time for questions, somebody reminded me that it's traditional for me to end my presentation at Woodford with a song. 20 years ago, when I ran out of things to say at the Great Green Debate, I reminded people that Bob Dylan's song, "The Times They Are A-Changing," is, if anything, more relevant now than when he wrote it 60 years ago, because the waters have around us grown, and we will sink like a stone if we don't stop swimming. And probably the only thing we need to amend is that the writers and critics no longer prophesise with their pen, but with a keyboard. Come gather round, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and expect it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you'd better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are a-changing. Come writers and critics who prophesize with your pens, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't spook too soon, for the wheel's still in spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming. For the loser now will be later to win, for the times they are a-changing. Come, senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorways, don't block up the hall, for he who gets hurt will be he who has stalled. There's a battle outside and it's raging. It'll soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times they are a-changing. Come, mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly changing. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand, for the times they are a-changing. The line it is drawn, the curse it is cast, and the present now will soon be the past, and the slow one now will later be fast. The order is rapidly changing, and the first one now will later be last, for the times they are a-changing. And who knows, we might get politicians who accept that they have a long-term responsibility. Questions, please. There's a microphone on its way to you, sir. Colonel Freeman, whose talk today about regenerative farming was just wonderful.
Apparently I had a typo, so when I hand my PhD into Professor Lowe, my spelling will have to be up to speed. Professor Messianic, I think we need to have a yarn after this, if that's all right. Firstly, just in winding back his brilliant speech, I mean, what a command of your discipline. Just Messianic. First comment, I would say, why aren't you the Minister for Environment? Because those other clowns in Canberra know about a 100th of what you know, Professor. Can I just indulge with Bob Dylan? Because when I was an undergraduate, I've seen Bob Dylan 4 times in concert, and at Festival Hall, which you may remember, which is a beautiful little venue, his first encore was The Times Are A-Changing in 1978. Then he did Knocking on Heaven's Door.
Yeah.
So I've still got 28 Dylan albums, so we can yarn about that. Who is the genius? Why did Noosa, who is the architect that thought to create this biosphere here? And can you just expand a little more on the contiguous zones when you talk about the Great Sandy Area? You're talking about the coast, or
Sunshine Coast, yeah.
Could you give me the full geography of where this brilliant, and who is the architect? What was the genius to create this?
I don't think it was a genius. I mean, I think Noel Playford was probably mayor of Noosa at the time. Tony Wellington was heavily involved, and his books about Noosa are just a joy. But the UNESCO program started in 1971, and after Noosa took its decision that it wanted to limit both resident numbers and tourist numbers to maintain the integrity of natural systems, somebody who was around at the time, I don't know who, decided they should submit a proposal to UNESCO. And I've still got the proposal, and I mean, it's about the size of the Sydney phone book was in the days when we had phone books. It's about that thick, because they had to demonstrate to UNESCO that their approach was consistent with the criteria for being a biosphere. Yeah. And they've had to reiterate that 10 years later. And I'm not sure what happened in the Sandy region, but I know I spoke this week with one of the officers in the Sunshine Coast Council, and he said it's a responsibility that they take very seriously, that planning isn't just about meeting short-term needs. It's about making decisions that they can put their hand on their heart and say, we believe this is sustainable. And in that sense, I've argued that the biosphere should be a model that every local authority and every state and territory government should aim at. We should all be making decisions that we can, at least in principle, believe might be sustainable.
I wish we could have that wisdom on the Gold Coast, because I'm up at 1,000 feet. I look down on what I call surface parasite. And sadly, even we've got a little place on the beach at Palm Beach, they're allowing 8 stories now, which is just unforgivable, and it's just dumb. The funding, because this is such a good project, how does the Noosa Shire Council get enough funding? Because you said they're doing this 10-year review.
Yeah. And
that's a lot of, I imagine, a lot of science and a lot of costs. Who helps fund that? Is it state or federal government, or has Noosa got to stump up itself?
Yeah, Noosa has to stump it up. I mean, Noosa gives the Biosphere Reserve Foundation an annual allocation that is being negotiated at the moment. Last year it was $140,000, which is enough to run an office and a couple of part-time employees, and to fund half a dozen small projects, to top up a PhD scholarship and extend another project that was going ahead in the Sunshine Coast to also go into the Noosa region, because koalas don't know that there's a boundary, and so it makes sense to have an integrated project. So it's quite a limited budget, and I think within the Noosa Council, I think they have 4 officers in the environment area, and for the next year, one of them is going to be more or less full-time documenting to UNESCO that they're maintaining the principles of the biosphere.
Brilliant. After this, if you could maybe put me in touch with some literature and we can have a yarn.
Sure.
Sorry to dominate, ladies and gentlemen. It's just the best Messianic speech I've ever heard.
I'll look that up later and find out whether that was an insult or a compliment. I'm not a messiah, I'm just a very naughty boy.
Professor Lowe, thanks again, excellent. About the Biosphere Reserve, we had Jeff Hansen present at the Woodford last year, and also the shark campaign leader was here, Jonathan Clark, and they talked at length, and you can see you know about the shark nets and the drum lines, which you have in this shire or in this biosphere. Are there blots within biospheres that should become priorities? Or am I completely wrong? Is that not a blotch on this excellent work?
Yes, it is a blotch. And in fact, one of the projects we're doing is trying to do convincing enough science to persuade politicians to make a more responsible decision. But there has to be good science, and we think that the science. But the problem will always be that deciding whether the science is persuasive or not is always a value judgment. Just as I can remember back in the 1980s, the science had shown clearly that human activity was changing the composition of the atmosphere and the amount of trace gases that we call greenhouse gases. And the science was showing clearly that the climate was changing. But a lot of cautious scientists were saying it's too early to put your hand on your heart and say we know that the changes we're seeing in climate are being caused by the changes to the atmosphere. And that was a value judgment, and that was a defensible position. And that was why the IPCC was set up to do the science. So by 1995, the scientific jury was back in. Science was saying, yes, human activity is changing the climate, but the science has to be done. And similarly, I think the science is convincing that surfers would not be less safe if sharks were more safe. But that's a value judgment, and we have to persuade the decision makers. And the problem is that decision makers tend to be timid, and it would be crass to say they would rather see 100 sharks die than one surfer, but it's probably true, if crass, to say that nothing makes a politician more worried than the thought of harm coming to ratepayers for which they could be blamed. Another question in the middle.
Hi, and thanks. My name's Mark. I'm concerned, I guess. I've spent my life doing transport planning, traffic engineering. I've been on the coast.
You said you're concerned. I mean, if you're not concerned, you're not paying attention. I mean,
well,
we should all be concerned.
And it's interesting, right? We share a kind of common. Well, I did a PhD with Peter Newman. I don't know if you know Peter.
Yeah.
I think you do. So on the coast, I've been working on transport planning projects for a long time, and I don't see a diminishing demand to that transport demand in the way in which our projects are delivered, funded. The entire thing it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. When I look at the Noosa biosphere concept, I think Noosa does really well for its economic tourism, but I'd be interested to see how are they capturing that climate change contribution of people who travel from all over the world to go to Noosa.
Yep.
And then secondly, within Sunshine Coast, the Biosphere Reserve, like I just looked it up, and I've been involved in planning projects, infrastructure projects on the coast for years. Not once in my experience have those projects had to address this biosphere decision-making process to say, okay, how is that project going to contribute or diminish from this biosphere? So they sound lovely, but in the jobs that I'm involved in, which are big scale, big infrastructure things, we're just responding to transport main roads and how business cases are developed. And, there's just this miss between the philosophy of let's go save the planet. And when we get down to the brass mechanics of project delivery, it's not part of it. So I'd really like to hear how we in the industry can change how we're making those decisions and better support a Biosphere Reserve. So
I mean, the fundamental point is the legal framework. I can remember a leading councillor in Brisbane City Council saying that he'd come to the decision it was almost irresponsible to block an inappropriate development because the developer would always appeal to the Land and Environment Court, and the Land and Environment Court would always side with the developer. And I've given presentations about the limitations of environmental law, and the Samuel Review showed that the current law is ineffective. We were promised in 2022 that an incoming Labor government would revise the law and institute an environmental protection authority that would have the power to enforce the law, and that hasn't happened. We're now being told again that an incoming Labor government will develop a more appropriate law and have an authority to enforce it. And I think when I reflect on why we don't get decent environmental laws, I'm forced to the conclusion that the law is really the concrete embodiment of our social values. And if our social values see economic growth as more important than protecting the environment, we can't be surprised that that's what the laws do. And really, we will only have effective environmental laws if we persuade our decision makers that protecting the integrity of the natural systems is far more important than the short-term profitability of development projects. In terms of the impact on climate of people going to Noosa, I've actually got a proposal before the tourist industry, and I've offered to supply them with a ready reckoner, which enables them to calculate the carbon cost of people coming to Noosa, depending on whether they drive or fly, how far they've travelled. And I'm arguing to them that there should be a levy imposed on all visitors reflecting the carbon cost of their coming there, and that levy should go into a dedicated fund which is funding the projects looking at the integrity of natural systems. And because I think, in terms of our budget, we're trying to put out a bushfire with a water pistol. Our budget's minuscule compared with the budget of people who want inappropriate development, and we'll always be fighting with one hand tied behind our back if we can't fund the science to show that the developments are inappropriate. So I take your point exactly that Noosa needs to take into account that people are putting huge amounts of carbon dioxide into the air to get there. And so I think it would be entirely responsible to levy those visitors for a dedicated fund that's doing the science to ensure that we're protecting the natural systems. Thanks for your question. And I'm being told that the stage hook is out, so thanks very much. Have a great planting.
Thank you so much, Ian. It's fabulous. And I think we can agree with his colleagues' assessment of him as being messianic. It was fabulous.